Hey guys, welcome back. No, I'm not in jail. We're talking about framing and composition. And why are we talking about it? First, let's get rid of this. All right, now the reason why we're talking about framing and composition, and I know it's been done to death, but there's a reason for that. One, if you've been doing this for a while, it's always good to go back to the basics, to where it all began, and get rid of bad habits that you may have picked up along the way. Yes, these are rules, and rules are made to be broken, but you really need to understand the rule before you break it. Now, there's a lot of brand new photographers, videographers coming into the scene, especially with YouTube the way it's going. It's good for them to get the basics and get that solid foundation to help them progress on their career. That's why we're doing this. So let's get into it, and we got 5 points we're going to cover under composition and framing. Well, the first piece of composition we're going to get into is, like everyone's heard, the rule of thirds. And actually this frame here kind of represents how the rule of thirds goes. And normally you have 2 lines across, not one, but it's dividing your picture frame up into those segments. That's why it's called the rule of thirds. Now I've got some examples that I can show you. And you can see here in this picture here where the model's off to the side and where she falls on those lines. You want to try and put the subject on one of the points of interest, meaning where those lines all intersect. In the other examples, you can see how it makes a big difference with the model being on the points of intersection, whether it's on the top right, the bottom left. You can see how it creates a little more interest in the image, and the image isn't quite so static. The basics of how the rule of third works. Now, if your camera has the grids built in, turn them on. Your cell phone typically has grids, turn them on, and use those to help compose your pictures. Okay, let's talk about horizons. Now, you can see that the 2 cross lines going across the horizontal lines, if you put the horizon on one of those points, it makes the image more interesting. If you put the horizon dead center, it becomes static and is not so interesting. If what's above the horizon is more interesting, then you want to have more of that in your photo. If your foreground is more interesting than what's above the horizon, then you want more foreground in it. So in this example here, you can see I've included more of the foreground with the tree and less of the horizon, and it makes a bit more interesting picture. Well, what happens if I go the other way, like in this example? So you can see how the two work, and it's up to the artist and your preference to which way you want to go with it. But that just shows you, don't put the horizon in the middle, bounce it off to close to one of the lines or on one of those lines, and I think you'll find that you'll create a lot more interesting photo. Now we're talking about leading lines. And what I'm talking about there is when you see a picture of railroad tracks running in behind, a winding road, those are all leading lines that make your eye follow in through the image, typically to a point, or to help bring focus to it and gives the image a little more power. Now you can see this image here with the model, how I've got the leading lines, and your lines don't need to be straight. Like this one here, you can see how it's kind of bending a bit. So your leading line don't have to be dead straight lines. They can be a winding road, a curvy path. They're all leading lines. It could be part of a bridge running along. They're all lines that are leading and help bring your attention more to your subject. So when you're doing your images, remember your rule of thirds and where you're placing things, but also think about some leading lines which will help make your image a little more powerful by having those lines kind of converge back. Makes a big difference to your images, as you saw in those ones there. Okay, I said about not putting the subject kind of in the middle of the frame. You need to go on one of those points. But you can put your subject in the center and do a symmetrical image where they're centered. Like in this example here, you can see how everything's centered, but it has a pretty good impact to it. And this image was actually used on a few book covers. You balance the image out by making it symmetrical. I mean, look at this one here with the arches and everything else. It creates a dramatic image because everything's balanced with it. And the same as in this one. So you can center your image, but make sure that you're getting a nice balance and that it's working and it's not just something small within the frame and everything's kind of off kilter. You want to try and make sure that it's fairly symmetrical to create a greater impact with your image. Our next point is framing, and frame within a frame. Now, I showed you the picture of the arches before in the symmetrical one, but here it's a little differently done, and you can see how the archwork is framing the lake and the trees in behind. So I'm using that architecture to frame the picture in behind. So you can use objects to frame things, like here I'm using tree branches to frame in the model. How about some window shears with a bride? You can use multiple things to frame in your subject, whether like it's kind of in the foreground and it's framing around. You just want to simply create a kind of a frame network to have your subject in. Again, we're doing all this composition stuff to help drive strength and impact to your images and to make them more interesting. All right, foreground. That's something you really need to think about, and how you can include it in your image to really create some oomph and impact to that image. How about this one with the waterfall? Look at how you got that rock and stuff at the front, and the creek leads back into that bit of a waterfall. So I've got some leading lines, I'm doing the rule of thirds, and I've got a strong foreground. And look at how cool that impact is. How about this bride sitting here with a dress down into the front, into the foreground to create that impact. So placing things in the foreground can really strengthen up the quality of your images. And when you're applying all these different principles, you can get some really interesting, really powerful looking images. We're talking rule of thirds, we're talking leading lines, we're talking symmetry, we're talking foreground, framing. All these points you need to consciously think about. Especially as a beginner, you really need to consciously be thinking about all this. Use those grid lines. You can create some really powerful and some amazing photos. All right, that's it for this one. If you're new to the channel, please subscribe. Hit that bell notification so you're aware when I post new videos. If you enjoyed this, please give us a thumbs up. So, until the next time.